Hello, and welcome to Cutting Through. I'm Mitchell Plitnick. Um, November 17th, 2025, saw the final nail hammered into the coffin of international law. That happened when the United Nations Security Council gave its imprimatur to an agreement governing the Gaza Strip made completely independently of any significant Palestinian input. You know, it's hard to escape the fact that the international community has done this before, and it was over a century ago when they carved up the Middle East into various fiefdoms, and that didn't end well, uh, not in Palestine and not in the rest of the region. This effort now is even more poorly considered than that one was, although it's motivated by similar colonialist impulses. Um, we're seeing an attempt driven by the Trump administration to reassert a sort of proxy Western dominance, not directly, so there wouldn't be anything like the British Mandate or anything like that, at least not in a long-term sense. There wouldn't be, this sort of colonial control of spheres of influence as there were between mostly Britain and France back in those days. Instead, we'll have the proxy governments and the allies of the United States essentially carrying out an American-led policy that ensures that the people of the region, not only the Palestinians, but all the people of the region, remain uh, essentially under the thumb of the West and have little recourse um, because they will be living among, under dictatorships that are the oldest ones in the world at this point, and are completely beholden to Washington. I think when we look at what happened on Monday, two things. There's two different ways to look at it. I mean, one is the assault on international law that escalated so seriously after Hamas's attack of October 7th, 2023. I mean, international law had been assailed primarily by the United States and Israel for decades before that, um, used when it was convenient, attacked when it wasn't, and ignored most of the time. Again, unless it was convenient to actually use it. That had been going on for a long time, but since October 7th, it's really escalated a lot. And some of it is just simply a result of the policies that were pursued. The United States under Joe Biden utterly defied international law and granted Israel complete impunity in committing genocide in Gaza, covered for it diplomatically, lied for it in the media, um, continued lying for it even when their lies were exposed, lied to Congress about it. As we know from Secretary of State Antony Blinken's frankly bullshit testimony, where he just bald-faced lied to Congress about what was happening in Gaza, what the State Department knew was happening in Gaza, because he had suppressed a report from his own State Department on what was happening in Gaza, caused many people to leave that State Department. And of course, we were arming that genocide all along. And yet, at the same time, Biden was asserting that we must stand for international law. We cannot allow war criminals, but only when it was ideologically comfortable, particularly when it was the war criminal was Vladimir Putin rather than Benjamin Netanyahu. So, he defended Ukraine. I mean, this is, of course, an old story. This has been pointed out for the past 2+ years frequently by supporters of the Palestinians, the hypocrisy, the double standard. But the point here is how much that hypocrisy and that double standard undermined international law's credibility, which was already not doing great. International law has always been something that was pursued when the powerful decided to pursue it. So it was a very selective kind of law, even though many of the jurists involved, most of the jurists to my knowledge involved, were sincere and were really trying to uphold international legal principles. But the reality was they could not act without the support of the Security Council. The Security Council has long been under the control, essentially, de facto, of the United States. So, but even with that, and as much as people saw that hypocrisy over the decades, it was so blatant and so shameless when you looked at Ukraine on the one hand, and calling Vladimir Putin's aggression illegal is correct. Calling Putin a war criminal is certainly correct. We're just hearing recently about more stories about forced conscription of Ukrainians into the Russian army, uh, among so many other war crimes that Russia has committed. And yet, when it came to the Palestinians, where the at least one can say in Ukraine, and it's no comfort to anyone with the amount of blood and death and injury that has happened, both to Russians and to Ukrainians, but at least those have largely been military, and most of the targets have been strategic military targets. In Gaza, civilians and civilian infrastructure and civilian sites were targeted almost exclusively. The IDF's own numbers show. And they have a very broad definition of who is considered a combatant and a legitimate target. And even given that, their own numbers show that 83% of casualties in Gaza were civilians, non-combatants. It's the IDF's own numbers. So that's a low estimate, 83%. And yet, international law was only supposed to be deployed against Putin, not against Netanyahu. It was supposed to be deployed against Russia, not against Israel. The world saw this. So international law just took a beating over that. And then, of course, Trump came along and was quite, unlike Biden, who wanted to pay lip service to international law so he could use it when it was convenient for him. Trump said, hell with that. Trump has been very clear that he is not interested in what anyone else says. He will do what he will. That has been the attitude of most, if not all, American presidents. Trump is just more radical about it and more upfront about it. So, under both Trump and Biden, the United States ridiculed and degraded the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court. They just went about their business meeting with wanted war criminals like Benjamin Netanyahu, Yoav Gallant. And this was very much bipartisan. Go look. All you have to do, look up, Google Cory Booker and Yoav Gallant's name. Just put Cory Booker, Yoav Gallant into Google Images, and you'll find that picture right away of a smiling, proud Democrat Cory Booker standing there with a man who was at the time wanted for war crimes, Yoav Gallant. And it wasn't even like it needed to be a state visit. By that time, Gallant was already out as defense minister. It just shows you. So this is not a Democrat or Republican thing. This is very much a bipartisan thing. It didn't matter that the ICJ had issued orders to Israel to not just to allow aid into Gaza, but to facilitate it, which is their responsibility under international law. United States never pressed for that. Even when they were being at their most merciful and suggesting politely to their friend Netanyahu that maybe you could allow some food and water in, maybe you could allow a little bit of medicine in, and he was saying no. I mean, they weren't asking him to fulfill his obligations under international law, because under international law, it's Israel's responsibility as the occupying power to make sure that humanitarian supplies reach the people. Of course, that wasn't going to happen. The ICJ ordered Israel to halt its offensive in Rafah because it was so obvious what was going to happen there. The United States did nothing to try and press Israel to obey that, and of course, Israel just ignored it. The ICJ ordered Israel to support, not just cooperate, but support, and provide everything that was requested and needed for any investigation mandated by the UN. Of course, Israel always, even when the UN was ended up coming out with a relatively, I think, I would say too mild report on some of Israel's crimes and on crimes of Palestinians, just in general crimes of a gendered nature. Israel wouldn't cooperate with that one either, even though that one was considered by both sides, frankly, to be uh, unacceptable, one would say. So now with this new Security Council resolution that passed on Monday, we have this bizarre situation developing where a resolution is potentially in direct conflict with an ICJ ruling because the ICJ is still pending its decision, or its decision is still pending on South Africa's case against Israel for genocide. Um, and there is no accountability in this UNSC resolution. In fact, quite the opposite. It bends over backwards to give Israel everything it wanted. Uh, if it doesn't technically bring those two things into conflict, it certainly does in spirit. And I think it is quite possible that that will, in fact, influence the ICJ decision, uh, and potentially make them at least drop the case, or possibly not rule in favor of what literally every genocide expert in the world. Okay, maybe not literally every, but pretty damn close to, pretty close to a full consensus of genocide experts, human rights organizations, international legal scholars have called it genocide. It's an inescapable example of genocide, and the denial of it is appalling, quite frankly. So this resolution uh, was a terrible result, and I have to say, I have to admit this, I was wrong about this. When the initial draft of this resolution came about, I said there's no way the Security Council would pass it, and I was right about that. There was no way the Security Council was going to pass that resolution because it wasn't going to be supported by even by the U.S.'s Arab and Muslim partners. They were raising objections and demanded changes. And to be frank, I did not think Trump would make the changes that they were demanding. And I also thought that they would be demanding a little bit more than the changes Trump ended up making. Um, so I was wrong on both of those counts, and the ease with which Arab and Muslim allies of the United States, because ultimately the Security Council, you needed to get 10 votes out of the 15 members, and that none of the five permanent members would veto it. So Russia and China probably were not going to veto because, unless it was really egregious, because they don't want themselves to get too deeply involved in Gaza and in Palestine in general. And um, they also don't want to give the West fuel to accuse them of sabotaging peace in the Middle East. But I do think if it was really egregious, they would have vetoed it. And I think the changes that the U.S. made were enough to stop that. And I think the gauge that Russia and China were using is the same gauge a lot of the other Security Council members uh, were using, which is do the Arab and Muslim states in general support this? And unfortunately, the changes, which were really not all that significant, that Trump made to this resolution were enough to satisfy those states. And once those states were satisfied, the non-Arab, non-Muslim states that are on the Security Council at this time were not going to go against that. Um, so what's wrong with this resolution? I mean, fundamentally, what's wrong with it is that it basically gives an imprimatur to Trump's 20-point plan, which is not a plan. There are so many questions, so many things that are left open that even if you want to give the United States and even Israel every benefit of the doubt, there's just no specificity there. There's nothing there that says how any of these things are going to work. It creates this board of peace, but who's on the board of peace? You know, while the Board of Peace has this very, very broad mandate, are there any limits to it? Is there any accountability there? Trump's plan and this resolution have none. So um, there's just it is so very vague. What is the mechanism supposed to be for disarming Hamas, which is a sine qua non for any reconstruction and any international cooperation in Gaza? Even the Arab and Muslim states agree to that. So whatever, and I know that many Palestinians deeply disagree with that, and I know that many of my Palestinian allies deeply disagree with that. It's it's unfortunately uh, not only non-negotiable, but nobody's asking the Palestinians, and that's a problem. That's the biggest problem with all of this, and I will get to that in a bit. But let's actually look at the resolution. In its first declarative paragraph, it says it endorses the comprehensive plan, which refers to Trump's threadbare uh, and in my opinion, unwise 20-point plan. And it says that the UNSC now acknowledges that the parties have accepted it, and calls on all parties to implement it in its entirety, including maintenance of the ceasefire in good faith and without delay. Uh, so right off the bat, we're dealing with bullshit here. Um, Israel, and one of the major change that Trump made to this, which we'll get to a little later in the document, was that it mentioned the possibility that just maybe there might be a pathway to somehow a Palestinian state. That was the major change. That was what the Arab and Muslim states said they needed to be able to support this. And almost immediately after the deal was announced, Netanyahu came out and publicly stated there will never be any Palestinian state. I won't talk about it. I won't consider it. I won't do anything about it. So don't tell me the parties have accepted it. They have not accepted it. And that's beyond the fact that Hamas outright rejected it. And did so on a very obvious basis that this is an edict about governing the Palestinian people, in which the Palestinian people, literally none of them, have had any input. So the parties did not accept this agreement. They did not accept Trump's plan, certainly not in its entirety, although they did accept a ceasefire that is not being maintained. Okay. Somewhere around 250 Palestinians have been killed since the ceasefire. 1,500 buildings have been destroyed since the ceasefire. This is what a ceasefire means to Israel. The Palestinians cease and the Israelis continue to fire. So, and this is during this whole period where, the Trump's team has been making regular trips back and forth to Israel, talking to them, and it has not been a secret. This isn't just from reports from Palestinians. This is widely reported. It's widely known. Nobody listens to Palestinians. Nobody gives any credence to Palestinians, except it's not just Palestinians that are saying this. This is all over the main news. Israel's attacks on Gaza. Israel's saying what they're doing. They're telling the world, yeah, we haven't stopped killing people. It's true they're killing them in I wouldn't say much, but a notably slower rate. They have allowed some aid in. So the famine conditions aren't quite as bad, although people are still starving. People have no water. They are living literally after the recent rains in sewage. Uh, one can only imagine the diseases that are rampant, the curable diseases for which they don't have medicine, or facilities to deal with the sick. So people will die from that, and those people will not be reported on. So there's no ceasefire. So we're already dealing with this, sort of nonsense. And then we move on um, the next thing is that it will establish a board of peace. So the UNSC is now agreeing to that with no specificity of what that border peace will be. There's absolutely nothing. The only thing we've even heard of, and it isn't in the document, well, no, it isn't in the document. The only thing we've heard of is that Trump will lead it, which is already not exactly promising. Um, and other than that, nothing. We have no idea what this border peace is supposed to be. And this is the body where all the power is going to be, all of it. Um, the the condition for a potential Palestinian statehood comes in the second paragraph. So let's read this a little bit. Um, the establishing a board of peace for the redevelopment of Gaza pursuant to the comprehensive plan and in a manner consistent with relevant international legal principles until such time as the Palestinian Authority has satisfactorily completed its reform program as outlined in various proposals, including President Trump's peace plan in 2020 and the Saudi-French proposal, and can securely and effectively take back control of Gaza. The Palestinian Authority does not have in any real sense control of the West Bank. But even that point aside, we are very clearly talking here about a standard who decides. You know, there are no benchmarks here. That it comes in various proposals. Those proposals have all said different things, and even there, they have not been measurable conditions that the Palestinian Authority could meet. So how are they to do it? Who's to say at what point these so-called reforms are being faithfully carried out, as the resolution goes on to say? And it says that when those conditions have been faithfully carried out, the conditions may, and I stress that word may finally be in place for a credible pathway to Palestinian self-determination and statehood. The United States will establish a dialogue between Israel and the Palestinians to agree on a political horizon for peaceful and prosperous coexistence. I mean, if this isn't just a ton of bullshit, you've got to what is? This is so obviously nonsense. These are aspirational words that have no real world meaning. Political horizon? What does that mean? The credible pathway to Palestinian self-determination and statehood. Now, the word statehood is the big concession that the Arab and Muslim states wanted. But who decides on this credible pathway? Well, we know who's going to decide. Israel's going to decide. And what do you think that decision is going to be? I think it has to be made very clear here that all of the conditions and every single thing about this plan and about this resolution all fall on the shoulders of Palestinians to prove that they have a right to self-determination. When that is an inalienable right, they should not have to prove that. And nothing on Israel to show that they are not going to continue committing genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, human rights violations, and apartheid. There's nothing in this entire resolution that addresses any of that. Now, the third paragraph does give you something a little bit positive. It says that the Security Council underscores the importance of the full resumption of humanitarian aid and cooperation with the Board of Peace into the Gaza Strip in a manner consistent with the relevant international legal principles and through cooperating organizations. Notice, they underscore the importance. They do not demand. That is a very specific piece of language that is used in Security Council resolutions when it's supposed to say, this is what you have to do, and we as the Security Council have the force of law behind us to order you to do it. They do not use that language. They simply say it's important. I mean, that's even for humanitarian aid, and that's even on one of the better parts of this. It's completely subjective. And it does not constitute a legal requirement. It simply underscores the importance. Now, we do know that Trump has talked about resuming aid, and he said that Israel should do it, and he keeps saying Israel is doing it, but Israel's not doing it. There was some relief when the ceasefire was first called, but there has been enormous restriction on what was already insufficient aid, considering the enormous need in Gaza. So, I mean, it's mind-boggling that the Security Council is now agreeing to this. That's where the problems come in here. Um, Beyond that, this resolution gives both the Board of Peace and the International Stabilization Force, which we'll get to in a minute, broad and unspecified powers. So the Board of Peace oversees all of the governing. It's all to the Board of Peace. That's all in their purview and support. The only nod to any kind of Palestinian involvement is that they support a Palestinian technocratic apolitical committee of competent Palestinians from the Strip that will be responsible for the day-to-day operations of Gaza's civil service and administration. In other words, they can collect the trash. They can uh make do work on some maybe repairs for some pipes, um if they have the materials to do it. They can do the administrative tasks. I mean, I, this is pure humiliation. This is an insult, right? And it would be a very minor insult in the scheme of things if Israel was doing it, because next to some of the things Israel would do, it wouldn't be that big a deal. But this is the Security Council now doing this. This is a Security Council resolution. And in language that gets repeated, um, this clause in the resolution grants the Board of Peace any such additional tasks as may be necessary to support and implement the comprehensive plan. It has the power to carry those out. So basically, it can do whatever it deems necessary. And it has no accountability whatsoever to the people of Gaza. Um, Everything is governed by the Board of Peace. Whatever entities they can make, all these different outreach offices, business promotion offices, they can enter into contracts with this one and that one. They can offer land to outside investors, which they almost certainly will, certainly to investors named Kushner and Trump. Um, After calling on World Bank and other financial institutions to work on establishing a fund to pay for all this, we get to the International Stabilization Force, the ISF. The member states are supposed to work with the Board of Peace to establish it, and it is supposed to be established in Gaza to deploy under unified command acceptable to the Board of Peace, with forces contributed by participating states. They don't say who, but they do say in close consultation and cooperation with the Arab Republic of Egypt and the State of Israel, and to use all necessary measures to carry out its mandate consistent with international law, including international humanitarian law. You can throw that out because Israel, Egypt, the United States, and the countries that are rumored to be possibly participating in this, like Indonesia, Pakistan, and Azerbaijan, have never acted consistent with international law, and it's certainly not international humanitarian law. So that's just empty words. But look who when we're talking about how this military force is going to deploy, how it's going to behave, what its mandate is going to be, that happens in consultation with Egypt and Israel. Are you kidding? Are you kidding? I mean, not even they don't even give a nod, first of all, to including Palestinians in a consulting role or something like that. Um, and I mean, Egypt is an outright military dictatorship. Israel is a proto-fascist state at best. That is a settler colonial apartheid state, specifically an apartheid state that oppresses Palestinians, targets Palestinians specifically. And this is all about how Palestinians will be under this stabilization force, which is just basically a military occupation. The ISF will work with Israel and Egypt without prejudice to their existing agreements, along with the newly trained and vetted Palestinian police force to help secure border areas, stabilize the security environment in Gaza by ensuring the process of demilitarizing the Gaza Strip, including the destruction and prevention of rebuilding of the military, terror, and offensive infrastructure, as well as the permanent decommissioning of weapons from non-state armed groups, that they would protect civilians, including humanitarian operations, train and provide support to the vetted Palestinian police forces. There isn't a mention or even a hint or even an allusion to anything that could suggest that this force can protect Palestinians from Israeli attack, because Israel's coordinating it. So Israel is clearly going to be able to say, we want to hit this target. And they'll say, whatever, it's a terrorist site. They say that, journalists are a terrorist site, hospitals are a terrorist site, mosques are a terrorist site, schools, children, whatever. But that's what they'll say. True or not true, that's what they'll say. And they will hit that site. And there's nothing the ISF can do about it. There is no power granted here to protect Palestinians from Israeli attack. And that's the danger to Palestinians. That's where Palestinians are in danger. There's then a provision about how the ISF, as it asserts itself on the ground, will allow the Israel Defense Forces to withdraw from the Gaza Strip, as it says here, based on standards, milestones, and timeframes linked to demilitarization that will be agreed between the IDF, ISF, the guarantors, and the United States, except for a security perimeter that Israel will be allowed to establish. In other words, Israel will keep its forces along the Gaza border, probably several kilometers inside of it, as it was more or less doing before, where it had its security fence some meters inside of the Gaza border, and would fire on anyone who came anywhere close to it. So in effect, there was a buffer zone within Gaza. That will now be even much more militarized with Israeli soldiers, while the ISF, under the coordination of the Israeli military, will be the occupying force on the ground inside Gaza. What could possibly go wrong? Um, I mean, clearly, this is a recipe for resistance. And somehow or another, there will be that resistance. You can talk about disarming and this and that. There's going to be that resistance. And again, how do we even begin to address the fact that we are continuing to build up what is already a military regional hegemon in Israel after it's committed a mind-boggling genocide and is continuing to act aggressively in the West Bank, in southern Lebanon, in Syria, as well as in Gaza? It is violating every ceasefire it agreed to, but we keep giving them more and more weapons and upgrading those weapons while saying that the Gaza Strip must be demilitarized. I don't know how you do that. How do you sell that to anybody where it makes sense? What kind of thinking is that? There's only one way that makes sense. Okay, and that is anti-Palestinian racism. Palestinians cannot even be allowed to defend themselves because they are killers and crazy people who just want to kill Jews for no good reason whatsoever. This is actually what we're faced with right now. And this is what the UN Security Council has just given its imprimatur to. Um, So this Board of Peace is officially authorized by the Security Council for the next 2 years, 26 and 27, and the rest of 2025 as well. Um, any further reauthorization of the ISF um, uh, would be in full cooperation and coordination with Egypt and Israel and other member states continuing to work with the ISF. Um, the Board of Peace has really no end date in any real sense. Neither, and therefore neither does this ISF stabilization force. This is about a colonial full-scale reoccupation of Gaza. Will they rebuild it? Maybe. Um, I'm sure there will be a Trump hotel there if they do, right on the beach. Um, and there may be, you know, rejuvenated cities and towns. Uh, Gaza will not be allowed to be self-sufficient. I do not think we will see this Board of Peace authorizing a whole lot of rehabilitation for agricultural land that was pretty much all destroyed by Israel in the past 2 years, so that there's no way for Gazans to feed themselves if this Board of Peace should ever leave. So that is easy to manipulate so that Gaza is permanently dependent. Um, and it makes it much harder for Gaza to stand on its own 2 feet that way. Little things like that are going to become more important over the next couple of years. And there's no defending this plan. There just isn't. The idea that after a genocide, it's the victims of that genocide who have to be watched is consistent with the way Israel has carried out its occupation. Just as an example, yesterday settlers ran rampage through West Bank suburbs of Bethlehem, and so the next day Israel went and raided Bethlehem and brought a number of Palestinians, arrested them, and brought them in for detention. And who knows what will happen to them. One thinks back 30 plus years to the Hebron massacre when Baruch Goldstein killed 29 Palestinians as they were worshiping. And the response of Israel was to lock down the Palestinian section of Hebron. This is how it works. And this is what the Security Council just gave its stamp of approval to. And unfortunately, the reality is that now that that's happened, and I've told people over the years, international law is not a great vehicle for Palestinian liberation or anyone else's liberation. It can be useful for accountability for war crimes, but advancing political goals through international law is not wise, and not fruitful. But now it's different. But international law was necessary. We need international law. It still is necessary. But I do believe that this resolution has put the final nail in that coffin. So, not great news. Unfortunately, have to leave it there. And, if you found this video useful, please do like, subscribe, and share. You can check out my other videos on this channel. I have lots on many different subjects. So, yeah, I'm hoping that the next time I talk to you, it will be with somewhat better news.